This is like $4,000 worth of books, and none of them tell you the whole truth. So stick with me for 3 minutes, and you're going to know more about this subject than any of the so-called experts. Today we're talking about MKUltra, but not the hand-wavy Trust Me Bro podcast nonsense you see on the internet. The actual documented historical record about what they were actually doing to all of us. Specifically, we're going to talk about an aspect of these studies that nobody wants to touch with a 10-foot pole and you never see mentioned in any of the books. And that was the study of nutrition to weaponize and use against our population. What do you mean, Museum of Terror? Wasn't this just the use of drugs and hypnosis to try to control people, but in the end it just didn't end up working, so they just gave up on all of it? No, that's propaganda, that's completely false, and I'm going to prove it. And to do that, we're going to look at the work of one of the MKUltra contractors, Dr. Abram Hoffer. Dr. Hoffer was a medical doctor and psychiatrist who studied hallucinogens and their effects on the human mind, including schizophrenia and thought disorders. And Dr. Hoffer was involved in these things in some very interesting ways, notably with his involvement with none other than Colonel Al Hubbard, later Dr. Al Hubbard, because they gave him a fake PhD so he could open a clinic called the Hollywood Clinic in Vancouver, British Columbia, and experiment using DMT and LSD on people. Al Hubbard was known as the Johnny Appleseed of LSD, and he was supplying everybody, but he was a Fed and he was working for these mind control projects the entire time. In fact, these were the earliest people to experiment on what DMT and LSD were doing to the human mind. And it's funny that DMT and LSD and mescaline and psilocybin have all been so popularized by podcasters and Trust Me Bros these days as being part of the counterculture and the new society that they are building. It's almost as if people like Joe Rogan are being deliberately boosted up to push and popularize MKUltra technology to an impressionable and gullible youth. But I digress. Let's get back to Hoffer and what he found. He published some very interesting research, including Schizophrenia and Evolutionary Defense Against Severe Stress, which argues that so-called thought disorders like schizophrenia are not actually disorders. They're the result of a toxic reaction to a body system that is being overloaded with oxygenated adrenaline, which is known as adrenochrome. And I know a lot of you have heard that term before, adrenochrome. But a lot of what's being pushed out into the conspiracy lore may be propaganda to keep you from looking at what it actually is and what it actually does to all of us. In another paper, The Adrenochrome Hypothesis and Psychiatry, Dr. Hoffer offers this extremely interesting information, that during their LSD tests on alcoholics, he found that adrenochrome potentiated the activity of LSD. And that by testing LSD on several thousand unwitting alcoholics back in the 1950s, they concluded that LSD did not act as a hallucinogen in itself, that it induced an increase in the production of adrenochrome, which was the hallucinogen. Wait, what was it that I just said? I just told you that the MKUltra dweebs that were testing this originally found that LSD, mescaline, peyote, etc. were not the hallucinogens in themselves, that what they were doing is tricking the human body into releasing adrenaline that was oxygenated into this toxic substance known as adrenochrome, and that was causing schizophrenic reactions. Wait, what? Why don't any other researchers tell you this? Well, I don't know. You'd have to ask them how much they're getting paid to leave that portion out. But to get back around to the point of this video, what Hoffer also found is that our ongoing nutritional state, specifically our deficiency in the vitamin known as B3 or niacin, and that when you have a lack of niacin, it creates something called pellagra. And most people these days are in a state of what he called subclinical pellagra. That is, just before it becomes a major health problem that you need to go to a doctor or to a hospital for, you're operating at this state where you are just starting to see the symptoms. One of the major symptoms is psychosis and schizophrenia. Many people are operating in this state of low-level schizophrenia, psychosis, delusions, losing touch with reality. They're functional enough to go to work, to pay their taxes, to use their Excel spreadsheets, but they're losing a grasp on reality, and we are seeing this everywhere these days. All over social media, I see it every day in doing what I do. It's everywhere. And what all of the researchers leave out about these mind control programs is that they weaponized nutrition against us, that they are keeping the entire population at this low level of psychotic break where they can be controlled, where they can be guided to whatever political outcomes you might want, and they're not mentally well enough to identify what the real problems are and deal with them, so they're essentially lambs to the slaughter. And that's where we are today, and that's what Dr. Hoffer was warning about. And it's sad because I don't think Dr. Hoffer was necessarily a bad guy. I think he may even have been an unwitting dupe, not realizing what his research was going to be used for. He spoke and wrote and warned about his findings extensively, and he was largely ignored. Except at the top levels of government and military and intelligence operations, where I can guarantee you his research was seized upon for maximum effect on the poor gullible public. In fact, he wasn't the only MKUltra researcher that was doing this. There were other MKUltra researchers such as Dr. Carl Pfeiffer, and we actually republished his book on healing neurodivergent symptoms with vitamins and minerals, and he goes into depth about his findings that are perfectly in alignment with Dr. Hoffer, and he gives descriptions of what you might need to take in order to reverse any thought disorders or schizophrenia that you might be seeing. These guys found that a massive portion of it is nutrition-based. You see, everybody, MKUltra is completely misunderstood, and I think that's being done to you all on purpose. When we think of the catch-all term MKUltra, it's a meme that has been pushed out into the public, been pushed out into the conspiracy lore, and it largely acts to hide what was actually going on. The actual historical MKUltra was one project smack dab in the middle of dozens of other projects that went on for decades before and decades after. These projects were known by various names from Artichoke, Bluebird, Chatter, Delta, Naomi, Offen, Chickwit, as well as many other designations that we will never know the names of. And it wasn't just the CIA, it was also the Army, Navy, Air Force, British intelligence, Canadian intelligence, and foreign actors that we won't get into. But make no mistake, they studied everything from every angle. And they studied things like John Calhoun's research at the National Institute for Mental Health on his mouse utopia and behavioral sync, where they figured out just how far they can push populations before they completely fell apart and went extinct. They studied the nutritional side, they studied the drug side, they studied the electromagnetic side, and they brought it all together as various means, a whole toolbox to control the human mind. And they know what stimulus to give us to keep us in this pre-psychotic state, how to keep our adrenals constantly overloaded so our bodies are constantly filtering out this adrenochrome. And they also know what nutrition can counteract that and what technologies can counteract it. And they keep these largely out of our reach and keep people ignorant of them. Why? Why do I think they are doing this? Well, I think it all feeds into this transhumanist society where everybody is constantly being stimulated with electromagnetics, with constant bombardment and behavioral cues from the herd. They know how to keep us right where they need us without us completely breaking, without us revolting, without us ever gaining enough momentum to do anything about it. And it falls into all the old blueprints of Fabians like Aldous Huxley and H.G. Wells and their psycho-civilized society where everybody is just kept a little bit sedated, a little bit nuts, a little bit out of touch with reality and given their soma. You know, the kind of world where you will own nothing and be happy. And we don't even know the true scope, the true extent of the problem that is upon us right now. Why? Because all of the authors that wrote about it before, that were paid to write about it before, that got New York Times best-selling book deals about it before, didn't have a set of nuts to tell us what was actually going on, to describe the entire project. They gave us limited hangouts, limited information, and then all the chuckle podcasters gave them a platform to talk about it. So we thought that it was all over and done, that was the whole extent of the story without ever realizing just what was being done to us or the fact that there were options to counteract it. We are all completely under control, but it doesn't have to stay that way. I'm trying to offer the information that you need to get back on your feet. So without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Abram Hoffer's talk on nutritional deficiencies and anxiety and what can be done about them.
Today we are so very pleased to have Dr. Abram Hoffer, who is a world-renowned psychiatrist. He's also a medical doctor, and he has a PhD in agricultural biochemistry. What you may not know is that Dr. Hoffer was using optimal doses of nutrients long before the word orthomolecular became somewhat mainstream. He was doing this in the 1950s. But the word orthomolecular really didn't get its sort of notoriety until 1968 when Linus Pauling published a paper in the very prestigious journal Science. What we're going to do today is we're going to have Dr. Hoffer talk a lot about different concepts of orthomolecular medicine and really discuss in very good detail about anxiety disorders. So Dr. Hoffer, my first question is, I just mentioned orthomolecular medicine. Please define that for everybody who's watching.
I think the best definition was the one Dr. Linus Pauling published in the Science article in '68, and he referred to it as a treatment which depended primarily on the provision of the correct molecules of natural product which are normally present in the body. And this is a very important definition, and I've looked at it for years, and there's nothing really better because it excludes herbs. Herbs are a product which may be extremely helpful, but they're not normally naturally present in the body. So he was talking about using things like vitamins, minerals, enzymes perhaps, other compounds, amongst 1,000 that could be present in the body. These are the ones that he said we had to look at, and we had to make sure that each cell had the right quantity of these particular nutrients.
And how did he come to the conclusion that nutrients could control for conditions like mental illness?
Well, Dr. Pauling had been interested in this field for a long time. You may recall, Dr. Prosky, that he worked with sickle cell anemia, and he was the first scientist to really demonstrate what was the cause of sickle cell anemia. That started him thinking, and he began to write about what he called molecular medicine, not orthomolecular, but molecular medicine. Now, it's a very long story. I'll try to shorten it, but we had published a book called How to Live with Schizophrenia by my friend Dr. Osmond and myself. And I have to give you some clinical information. In 1960, I received a phone call from a doctor in a small California town. He was crying on the telephone, and he said, my son is age 12, he is schizophrenic, he's in the local mental hospital. I have just been told, he said, that he will never get well, and I have been advised to lock him up in a mental hospital and forget him. Now, this sounds pretty crude, but this was standard advice in 1960. And he'd heard, we had just published our first paper in 1957 where we described the use of large dosages of niacin or niacinamide for the treatment of acute, that is early schizophrenic patients. He located the article and he called me and I gave him the information. I said, if he were my son, this is what I would do. I would get hold of some niacin and start giving it to him. I told him exactly what to do and how much. So he's quite delighted, and he then was able to find a company in Oregon that was willing to make up special tablets for him, because in 1960 you couldn't buy 500 milligram tablets. The largest you could buy was 100 milligrams. They were so full of junk they would make you sick if you took them. So when happily he got these pills made, he went to the hospital to discuss with the professor who was in charge of the case, would he please put his son on niacin. Now, what happened is typical is what's been happening ever since. The psychiatrist blew a fuse, began to chew the rug, and he promptly made two lies. He said, one, we have tried it and it doesn't work, which was a lie. And second, he said it'll fry his brain. He was talking about the flush, but it doesn't fry people's brains. It may open up their skin, but as you know, does nothing to their brain. So he went home very unhappy. But he was determined he was going to get that vitamin to his son. His wife wouldn't go. She was too frightened to do that. So he decided that he would visit his son every afternoon and feed him niacin while they were walking in these beautiful grounds of this hospital. The boy liked jam. He was a jam nut. He loved jam. So his father made up a jam sandwich which consisted of white bread, jam, niacin, jam, and white bread. And as they were walking through the grounds, he would feed his son these jam sandwiches. And one day the boy said, Daddy, he said, every time I eat this sandwich, I turn red. Father got very worried. He said, maybe he'll say the same thing to his psychiatrist. What will I do? I said, change him to niacinamide. It's the same vitamin. It won't work quite as well, but it won't turn red. Anyway, this young boy recovered. He eventually took medicine. He in fact, worked with Linus Pauling for a summer. and he became a research psychiatrist practicing in Los Angeles. Well, now, this became a really amazing phenomenon in this small town, and the next case was a young woman who was turning out for the Brooklyn Ballet Company, and she became psychotic. She failed to respond to any treatment. Her father brought her up for me to treat in Saskatoon. I put her on treatment, and she was well within a month. She went back home, and again, this was a major incident in this small town. The father felt that he now had to proselytize this whole treatment, so he bought a whole bunch of these books. And he went to visit each doctor in that town, in Carmel, and left a book with them. And one of the people who received his book was a psychiatrist, lady psychiatrist, who was a close friend of Mrs. Ava Pauling. And one day, Linus Pauling and his wife were visiting her, having tea, and on the coffee table, there was my book. And I could see Linus. Linus didn't like small talk. He liked to talk about important things. And I visualized, and this is his story. He told this story many times. He read the book. He sat there, "May I take it? May I borrow it overnight?" And she said, "Delighted." I think she wanted to get rid of it. So he spent the whole night reading the book, and the next morning it changed his life. It was 65. And the question was, how could any individual tolerate 3,000 milligrams a day of niacin, which is 1,000 times as large as what you would need to prevent pellagra? He was so excited about this finding that he began to look into it. And that led directly to his interest. So our book, How to Live with Schizophrenia, seduced Linus Pauling to joining us in this great battle we've been waging ever since.
So the beginnings of orthomolecular medicine really began with interest in schizophrenia.
Absolutely. Started in Saskatchewan in 1952. I was director of psychiatric research for the province. We had 2,500 chronic schizophrenic patients. We had no treatment for them. We had the worst mental hospitals in the world. We had to do something about them. So I was made director of psychiatric research. And Dr. Prowse, I had a tremendous advantage. I knew no psychiatry. And that meant no one could tell me that there's nothing. I didn't learn what I couldn't do. You know, if you learn art or science, they tell you what you can't do. No one told me that you can't do this. And so we established, Dr. Osmond joined us. We developed a hypothesis, which I won't go into, and on the base of that hypothesis, it drew attention to the possibility that B3, that is either niacin or niacinamide, could be helpful. We started our trials, and we were the first psychiatrists in the world to do double-blind controlled experiments. And there we showed, after about 2 years, between 53 and 1960, we ran between 4 and 6 double-blind controlled studies, and we showed that simply adding this vitamin, 1 gram 3 times a day, to the standard treatment of that day, we doubled the natural recovery rate from 35% to 75%. So it all started long before Pauling became interested in, but he's the one, by giving it a name, Ortho, which is such a beautiful name, and with his immense prestige, his double Nobel Prizes, he was able to bring it to the attention of all the scientists. Of course, he didn't get good attention. Doctors hated him. They thought that he was getting senile because they said no PhD should be messing around with things like vitamins.
Well, Dr. Hoffer, how common are anxiety disorders among the population, or from what you see in practice?
I think it's very common. I don't know what the statistics are. I don't think anyone really knows, but I would guess maybe 5, 10, 15, 20% of people. I'm not talking about people who normally have anxiety when they should have it. If you're crossing the street and a car's descending on you pretty fast, you'd better have some anxiety. I'm talking about these chronic anxiety that will last long before the inciting event. But Dr. Prosser, before I go into that, I'd like to talk briefly about what we do when we examine the mental state of a particular patient, because anxiety is just part of that picture. And the way I do it, and here I'll follow a principle that was laid down by Dr. Carl Menninger, who is a very famous psychoanalyst, a good friend of mine. We look at perception. We look at perception. For example, if a patient has hallucinations, if he hears voices, sees visions, we're dealing with something more serious than just anxiety. We're looking at thought disorder or cognitive disorder, where a patient might become paranoid. If I think that you here have some poison in that cup and you're going to give it to me, I'm being paranoid. That's thought disorder, cognitive disorder, and that's again more serious than anxiety. Then we have the mood disorders, and here I'm talking about anxiety, which is not simply anxiety, but it's a composite. It's a mixture of depression and anxiety and insomnia and apathy and disinterest. And as I see it, there's a range of interest. At one end of the spectrum, the patient is primarily anxious, and is depressed because the anxiety prevents him or her from really accomplishing anything. The other end, you have a patient who is primarily depressed with very little anxiety, but is primarily depression. But I look upon all these as mood disorders. And the fourth thing we look at is behavior. If a person is behaving very strangely, if I walk down the street of Toronto when it's 100 above in my bare feet and without any clothes on, I'll soon find myself somewhere. Strange behaviors. So the mood disorder is only one aspect of a large number of different psychiatric disorders that we have to deal with.
Now, of course, in your evaluation of a patient using that way, that certainly doesn't correlate with the mainstream approach, which is using the DSM-4 or
That's right.
the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
Right. Well, the DSM-4, I'm using it now because I pretty well have to in order to conform. I'm a non-conformist, but I can't take it too far. I still have to conform if I'm going to live. My objection to the DSM-4 is it has no value. If I tell you, Dr. Prowski, you come to me and you complain that you have a pain in your abdomen, I say, okay, Dr. Prowski, I'm going to open you up and have a look. You're going to say goodbye and find another doctor. You want to know why. Why do I want to open you up? I'd have to diagnose you. I'd have to give you a reasonable diagnosis. I have to say, Dr. Prowski, I'd say, you have appendicitis. We have to get it out. You'd say, okay. You get the idea. Now in psychiatry, we don't have that. We have descriptive diagnosis. So if a patient is running around too fast, we call him hyperactive. He's not running around fast enough, we call him hypoactive. If he can't read, he's got a reading disorder. If he sees letters upside down, he's got dyslexia. We have, just in children, about 45 different names within the DSMO. We have about 45 different names for diagnosing children, and it doesn't matter what they diagnose them, they all get the same treatment. If a child sees 10 different psychiatrists within 2 weeks and comes back with 10 different diagnoses, he gets the same treatment anyway. They all get Ritalin. So what's the point? So what we have to go back to medicine, where the diagnosis determines treatment. And in psychiatry, the modern psychiatric diagnosis does not determine treatment. That's my objection.
So in modern psychiatry, we know that anxiety disorders can be classified into something like obsessive compulsive disorder, social anxiety disorder, panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder. But just like you said, all of them are pretty much given the same treatment.
Exactly.
So certainly those labels are almost futile. How would you then, what kind of labels then do you use that help guide your treatments of your patients?
I use the labels because I have to use them, but then I forget them. And what I try to find is why. If a person is anxious, I'd like to know, why are you anxious? Because then maybe I can treat you. I don't want to treat the symptoms. I don't want to suppress them by using powerful drugs. I'd like to find out why. Let me give you an example. A man who was an assistant to one of our deputy ministers came to see me many years ago, and he said he has to meet with his minister every morning at 11 o'clock, and he's terribly anxious. He just can't stand the panic and anxiety. And so he came to me for psychiatric help. And taking his history, it turned out that he never started the day with breakfast. His diet was atrocious. And I thought he was simply suffering from severe hypoglycemia, which coincided at 11 o'clock in the morning at the time that he would be visiting his minister. All I did was explain to him what I thought was wrong. I said, you've got to start your day with a good breakfast, lots of protein. Do that. And I straightened out his diet, and within a month he was normal. His anxiety was a response to a biochemical abnormality that we call hypoglycemia. So in dealing with any of these conditions, no matter which one I've described, in dealing with the mood disorders, the first thing I look for are the nutritional problems, the basic nutritional problems. Food allergies. You have no idea how many of these people that I see are allergic to dairy products. Take them off milk, and it's amazing how many within a month are free of their anxiety. I had one lady who drank 40 cups of coffee every day with 3 teaspoons of sugar in each cup. She couldn't live without it. Terrible anxiety. Took her off, put her on a proper diet, suggested that she go off all that coffee. She became normal within a month. So I look for nutritional reasons for anxiety. And any mood disorder, and here I'm talking also about depression, any of all the mood disorders I've seen, I think I've seen thousands by now, my guess is that 75% of all chronic depressions are caused by these allergies. Another example, a young man that came to see me about 3 months ago, 21. He said he'd been anxious all his life. depressed and anxious all his life. Well, that's a classical giveaway. It's got to be some kind of food. And what do young men drink from childhood? Milk and dairy products. So I took him off dairy products on a test, and I said to him, I want you to do a challenge test after you have been off it for a month. And if you're feeling better, then I want you to eat some cheese or drink some milk. So he went home, and 2 weeks later, he was normal. Everything was clear. So he ate some ice cream. 2 hours later, he was depressed. It came back full force, anxious. Then he went into a terrible agitated anxiety, panic state. They had to call the police to restrain him. He just couldn't be restrained. He had a terrible night, fell asleep at 8:30 in the morning, wakened at 11:30 in the morning. He's been well ever since. So this is a large part of my practice, is to determine what they might be allergic to.
Now, how do you do that? Because there's people who want to use blood testing for that. And there's other authorities who say the best way to go is to use a hypoallergenic diet, that means a very bland diet, then followed by a period where you introduce foods that you suspect, as a doctor, that could be causing the anxiety reaction.
I like the second approach better, although you can improve that. I don't place much value in the blood tests. I think they can be helpful, especially some of the cytotoxic tests can be helpful if they're run properly. The usual skin tests are of absolutely no value whatever. The electrokinetic tests, I don't think they're much value either. So I don't use them. I think that the best and the cheapest is simply to try and guess what it is they're allergic to and to put them on a straight elimination diet. It doesn't have to be non-allergenic. If you think it's milk, take them off milk. If you think it's milk and wheat, take them off wheat. I'm allergic to milk and oats and oranges. What else? Peanuts. I know that, so I have no problem with that. So, and then they, after they have been off that particular product for at least a month, then they do a challenge test. They reintroduce, as you said, back into their program what might be the factor, and if they get sick within an hour or two or the next day, this is evidence that they do have a problem. So then they keep away from that product for a long time, and perhaps after 6 months, they might be able to have it occasionally, but they can't go back onto a steady diet.
Now, you've also written about a water fast.
Yes.
To make things a little bit quicker, could you not then put your patients on a water fast?
Yes, you can, and I've done that. I've done that especially with my schizophrenic patients, because the same thing which I'm talking about with anxiety states also applies to schizophrenia. I have fasted over 200 schizophrenic patients where I wanted to find out in a hurry what it was they were allergic to. And I found, and these were patients who had not responded as well as I would like them to have with the straight vitamins that I was then using. And I found that 160, when they went back to individual food challenges, what you do is you do your 4-day water fast, which I've done 3 or 4 times. Then you go back with 1 food per meal. And whenever you find a food that makes you sick, that's the one that you eliminate from your diet. So I found that they all had, 160 of the 200 had 1 or more major food allergies. And since this is Toronto, I want to tell a story about Toronto. Many years ago, a young woman decided that her husband was going to kill her. He wasn't, but she decided he was going to kill her. She was paranoid. So she fled Toronto, naturally, intelligent. She fled from her husband, and she went to visit her sister in Saskatoon. His sister realized she was quite sick and brought her to see me. And at that time, I didn't have any beds free. All my beds at the hospital were tied up, and I couldn't admit her, but I knew she should have been in hospital. So not being able to admit her, I said to her, would you mind? And her sister was with her. I said, would you do a 4-day water fast? And the sister said, sure, I'll help her. So they did the water fast. And they came back to see me a couple of weeks later, and I said, what happened? And she said, at the end of the water fast, she was normal, totally normal. She phoned up her husband and said, dear, I was so stupid. May I come back home? And I took her more history, and then she had had pain in her hips. Now, I'm not talking about food, I'm talking about aspirin. But it's the same thing. She'd had pain in her hips, and she began to take an aspirin tablet. An hour later, she was psychotic. Turned out that she had been given aspirin in Toronto. She had been taking aspirin for 2 years. She had been admitted for 3 different times in Toronto Hospital for schizophrenia, simply because she was allergic to aspirin and no one bothered to check whether or not she was reacting to aspirin.
Now, you talk about the label cerebral allergies. Do you think that adequately describes patients who have, I guess, mental manifestations from causative foods?
Actually, what we are describing there is schizophrenia.
Right.
Yeah.
Due to a cerebral allergy.
Due to 1 or more foods or drugs or chemicals or anything. It can be anything. That's true, and they're called cerebral allergy. This was a term developed by a good doctor friend of mine from Winnipeg, Dr. Krabinsky, and I think it was a very appropriate term.
Now, have they isolated any compounds in foods that potentially can cause reactions? Like, for example, I know in chocolate there's something called phenylethylamine that can be quite stimulating and make people feel rather euphoric. We know there are compounds in even wheat called exorphins that can actually profoundly sedate people. So I would imagine that any food can potentially cause a reaction.
It can be any food. I don't know if it's any particular item in that food. I'm really not sure whether this has been looked into. I know it's not specific to the food, it's specific to the animal. For example, I forgot to tell, I'm allergic to hen's eggs. If I eat an egg, I get terribly sick. But I can eat duck eggs. I love duck eggs, no problem at all. So it's not the egg, it's the animal. And it has to do with the composition of the protein, I think, which is the major factor. And these foods, I'm sure you know, I know you know, they cause a chronic inflammation of the bowel, and therefore the intestine doesn't absorb properly the vitamins and minerals that it ought to absorb from the food supply. And anyone with a long-term food allergy is bound to develop a large number of nutritional deficiencies.
Now, besides allergy, there are certainly other labels that we can give patients that we're working out with an anxiety disorder. For example, vitamin dependency or deficiency. Yes. Maybe you can at least talk about the difference between a deficiency and a dependency, and then we can go forward from there.
Yeah. These are very important terms, and I'm glad, Dr. Prosky, you brought them up. A deficiency is very simply where the person is pretty normal, their requirements for nutrients are normal, but their diet doesn't provide even those. And a classical example are the vitamin deficiency diseases, like pellagra and scurvy and rickets. These are, in pellagra, for example, the diet is so bad, it was endemic in the southeast United States, where their diet was primarily corn, and the B3 in corn is so tightly bound it can't be absorbed. And they had huge epidemics of pellagra every year until it was solved by a very famous epidemiologist, Dr. Joseph Goldberger. That's a deficiency, because the problem is in the diet, it's not in that particular person's body. But suppose, on the other hand, a person has a need for 100 milligrams of niacin, and not even the most perfect diet in the world can match that, he'll get just as sick as if he were a pellagra. But the reasons are different, and so we call this a dependency, in the sense that that particular person has to have a lot more of that vitamin in order for it to do its job properly. So that's a dependency. And if you're talking about the anxiety state, you're right. We have the same. We have people who are deficient. One of the classical symptoms of pellagra is, in fact, anxiety. In fact, pellagra can mimic anything. There isn't a single disease that cannot be mimicked by pellagra. We have dependency, and I think often many of these anxiety states are dependent on niacin. I understand you're a favorite junkie for niacin, like I am.
Of course.
Yeah, I've been taking it for 50 years. I think it's great. So we have that deficiency, and that applies not only to niacin, it applies to B6, it can apply to minerals, it can apply to any vitamin. And it means, in fact, that if you have a dependency, and it's not like a drug dependency, many people confuse that, it's more like a dependency on food. You have to eat every day, so you might say we're dependent on food. And vitamins have to be considered in the same light.
Yeah, I like to look at it almost like an increased metabolic demand for a particular nutrient. For whatever reasons, for example, with niacin, we get about 13 milligrams from a really good diet per day. However, there are patients, as you and I would both agree, that require so much more of that to actually feel well. So they would have a dependency. For whatever reason, their metabolism requires much more than what their normal diet can bring in.
That's right.
Now, let me ask you something. We now categorize anxiety disorders partly due to allergies or cerebral allergies. Now we looked at vitamin dependencies, vitamin deficiencies, mineral dependencies, mineral deficiencies. Now let's talk a little bit about treatment. One of the main treatments, obviously, is niacin or niacinamide. Perhaps you can give us a lot of your experience in using these agents for anxiety.
Well, I've used both of them. I've used both niacinamide, which I think is better than niacin. The problem with niacin is that many young people don't like that flushing stage that they have to go through. They don't have to do that with niacinamide. In fact, it was shown about 1936, 37, 38 that niacinamide did have good relaxing properties. It was shown then. And there's even some evidence that the the receptors in the brain to which the acipines are attached are almost the same as the ones that vitamin B3 gets attached to. This was published by Merck, I think. No, Hoffman and Roche. But they have never followed up on it, which is rather strange. So I have used that niacinamide, and I especially, after you published that great paper of yours on niacinamide and anxiety, what was it, 3 years ago?
About that, yeah.
Since then, I've been using a lot more niacinamide, and I really think it works. That was a very important contribution that you made.
Thank you.
So I use that for anxiety state. But generally, my rule is that if you can't find a explanation, there's no food allergy involved, they're eating properly, you can't find any defect in their mineral intake thing, and psychologically there's no major reason why they're that way, then I'll assume that they have a dependency. And then I will usually start with vitamin B3, which is one of the most important. But you can't ignore any of the B vitamins. It can be folic acid. As a matter of fact, folic acid is turning out to be a very good anti-anxiety, antidepressant vitamin. I use a lot of that for my mood disorders, up to 50 milligrams per day of folic acid. Many doctors get frightened to death. They think that'll kill their patients. It's totally safe. As you know, there hasn't been a single death from vitamins in 50 years.
Now, let's talk about, the other mechanisms that niacinamide has in controlling anxiety. For example, in a few papers, and I know I have one coming out this year, more about niacinamide and anxiety, I know that yes, it does have benzodiazepine effects like you just mentioned,
Yeah.
but also when you take enough niacinamide, it actually increases the synthesis of tryptophan into serotonin. That might be another way by which it works.
That's right.
And another mechanism that I'm convinced that it has some value is the fact that it helps modify the way lactate is, I guess, felt in the body, for lack of a better term.
I mean, it helps clear lactate faster.
Yeah, it helps clear lactate, it helps metabolize it so that, as you know, in experimental models, you could inject lactate into animals and cause panic reactions and anxiety. What niacinamide does, it actually helps convert lactate back to pyruvate, thus sort of abolishing the sensitivity one could have to lactate.
Well, that's maybe why athletes are using it to a large degree. I use a lot of niacin for athletes. You might have heard about the study that was done with the marathon group.
No, I haven't.
They divided them in two groups. One group were given a good mixture of vitamins, including B3, and the other group were given placebo. And they were asked to run their usual time. The ones on placebo ran their usual time. The ones on vitamins knocked off 10 minutes. Can you imagine?
No, it's incredible.
Knocking 10 minutes off. Because not that they ran faster, but they ran faster longer. And I think because they cleared their lactic acid faster from their system.
Yeah, they had improved metabolism.
Yeah.
So, one of the things I found interesting is when I give niacinamide, I often give it in, gram doses as you suggested, but I like this sort of acronym, you start low and go slow, because what I found in anxiety patients, they tend to be very sensitive to their own bodily sensations. For example, a patient might come in thinking they're having a heart attack, but really it's because they have anxiety, they feel their pounding heart as though they're going to have a heart attack, impending doom. What I think is that I've found troubles in dosing niacinamide too high initially. I've caused some nausea in patients if I start off too high.
Yeah.
So maybe you can discuss how one should start with niacinamide in order to, I guess, avoid a lot of the side effects that can occur.
Well, if you want to be especially careful, you can start to 100 milligrams 3 times a day, which I think is too low to start with. It's usually safe enough to start with 500 3 times a day, usually always after meals. Even then, that might be too high for some people, and if that's the case, then I might then use the non-flush niacin. Most of the patients I see are already heavily medicated. They're not virgin patients when it comes to vitamins. So if they're in an anxiety state on heavy doses of medication, this often tends to protect them against any nausea from the niacinamide, so I just simply add, and I usually will start with 500 milligrams 3 or 4 times a day after each meal and before bed. But if I want to be especially careful, I may start with 100 milligrams or 250. They can break the pills in half and start with a low dose. But no matter what dose I start in with, I always instruct them very carefully that if there's any indication of nausea, they must do 2 things. They must stop taking it right away and then call me. And then I'll ask them to go off for a day or 2 just to stabilize, then to go back onto a much smaller dose. So doing that, the majority of patients can take it with perfect safety and without any side effects. But I do use medication as well. I don't like it, but sometimes I have to use it, but I try to get them off the medication as soon as I can.
In your book in 1962, Niacin in Psychiatry, which I happened to get a copy of last year, basically over the internet, it's a fantastic book. You do write how you're surprised that more interest hasn't been given to niacin or niacinamide, because in your book you write how it can actually enhance the effectiveness of conventional medications like benzodiazepines and other drugs for anxiety.
That's right.
Have you combined both of those in your practice?
Yeah, I have found that one of the major advantages of the vitamin approach is that we can reduce the amount of drug that is required, and therefore cut out many of the side effects. I'm not against drugs exactly. I'm against drugs with major side effects. If I could find a drug that had no side effects, I'd love it. And when you put a patient on vitamins, you can decrease the dose generally by half, and therefore get away from any of the side effects. I was surprised then. I can tell I'm still surprised.
You know, it's also interesting. There was another study where they took patients who were addicted to benzodiazepines, and they gave them intravenous inositol hexaniacinate, the non-flesh niacin.
Right.
And again, intravenously, I think over a 48-hour period, these patients were able to withdraw from the benzodiazepines with hardly any side effects.
Right. Well, have you read the work by Professor Bellmaker?
I don't think I have.
No. Professor Bellmaker is the chief. He is the chair holder of the Hoffer Vicker Chair of Psychiatry in Ben Gurion University. And he has published about 4 or 5 major papers discussing the anxiety-relieving properties of inositol. Now, he uses large dosage. It goes up to 15, 20 grams per day. But he has found that this particular B vitamin can also be very helpful.
They're saying that inositol works like a second messenger in the body. It actually increases the synthesis of, you know, serotonin and probably other neurotransmitters.
That's right.
But you're right, it's really non-toxic. These studies have used anywhere from 6 grams to 18 grams a day. I think 12 grams were used for, I believe, depression, 18 grams for obsessive compulsive disorder.
Right.
So anything along that range can be quite effective.
And these are very good studies. Now, this lets me lead into a book written by Professor Harry Foster. I love it. And we have estimated that half the Canadian population are lacking or would feel better if they took vitamin B3 either in small or large dosages. And to go back to what Dr. Linus Pauling did, he showed that in 1968 in his very famous paper, he showed how it was that we could lose the ability to make vitamin C and still survive evolutionarily. And we are proposing that same thing has happened to the human race. In other words, we are losing the ability to convert tryptophan into NAD, which is a form of niacin. We are losing that ability, and that's okay as long as we ate a diet that was good and strong in B vitamins. In the year 1800, white flour came in, white flour. And when people began to eat white flour, they lost almost all the B vitamins out of their food. And the first case of schizophrenia was described in 1800. And we are suggesting that we are now well into this evolutionary change where we are losing the ability to convert tryptophan, which is present in food, into NAD, and therefore we are more and more dependent on external sources of niacin in our food. And my prediction is that if the whole population, if we survive another 1 billion years on Earth, we will all have to depend upon large doses of vitamins in our food, and we will all be normal. And that's the gist of our book. I think it's a very important message, and the evidence is so powerful for that now.
So would you call that then a chronic pellagra or a subclinical pellagra type of condition?
Actually, it has been called subclinical pellagra. The pellagra was such a big problem that they had a specialty called pellagrologists. 1935. They were good, excellent, really good doctors. And in one of the papers on subclinical pellagra, there's a little footnote, about a 7 or 8 line footnote, where the doctor describes in 7 or 8 lines children who have subclinical pellagra. And you read that and say, my God, that's a modern description of the behavioral disordered child today. And Glenn Green, a GP who worked very closely with me for many years, he also wrote some papers on subclinical pellagra. And his idea was that all these children who are given 50 different diagnoses by the DSM-4 are in fact probably, to a large degree, subclinical pellagra. So when you put them on niacinamide, the vast majority of them get well.
So you would say then with a lot of our modern mood disorders like anxiety, a lot of the problems could be due to a need for extra vitamin B3 because they have subclinical pellagra.
Right. And we don't want to forget vitamin D. As you know, that's become extremely important. They now, I think the first double-blind control study done has shown that people with SAD, seasonal affective disorder, they get the winter blues, that their vitamin D levels in their blood are very low. And when you give them extra vitamin D, it acts as a very fine antidepressant. I am now using that on a standard basis. I give if a patient tells me they feel better in the summer than the winter, they're hit with vitamin D. And I use up to 10,000 units per day. And I think it's great for that. So it's not just B3, also the other vitamins are involved.
We talked a lot about vitamin B3 for anxiety, but of course there's many other nutrients that we could prescribe. We also mentioned inositol. We also mentioned vitamin D, but that was for seasonal affective disorder. But what about other nutrients for anxiety, like vitamin B12?
Well, I think that any kind of discomfort is going to cause anxiety. It doesn't matter what it is, it's going to cause anxiety. If I have a patient with a lot of anxiety, and it turned out that they're also cold, they feel better in a warm bath, they feel better when they're warm, I often think about a B12 deficiency. And then I will try it. And it works much better by injection than it does by mouth, although the sublinguals can be helpful, but they're not nearly as good as the injectable. So I will do a trial on them, and they will inject themselves, or they'll have their doctor inject them with B12, 1 to 5 milligrams injection. And if they're much better within the next 2 or 3 days, this is evidence that they're going to need some extra B12. And then they take it at least twice a week until they're feeling much better, and then one decreases the frequency of the injections. So B12 can be extremely important. And I don't go by the blood tests. I think the blood tests are totally fallacious. They're of no value whatever.
Yeah, I actually want to talk about that. There was a really interesting study published in one of the old names of the Orthomolecular journal, I think when it was called Orthomolecular Psychiatry. And the paper I really enjoyed because they took 49 patients and they looked at their serum levels of B12. And of those 49, 45 of 49 had normal serum levels. Then they looked at the actual cerebral spinal fluid levels of B12, and they found that 30 of the 49 patients actually had deficient levels in the brain. That sort of really confirms Dr. Pauling's idea, because there is an example of one compartment of the body being normal, yet the brain being starved for B12. And I would say in my experience with anxiety patients, just by giving them B12, you're right, blood tests are almost useless. I think it probably does increase the amount in their brain. And I think a lot of these people do walk around having a localized deficiency of B12 in their brain. And I've seen incredible things. I have one patient in particular who, without B12, her anxiety will return. As long as she comes once a month for a B12 injection in my office, her anxiety is not a problem at all.
Right. Well, the results can be very dramatic. It's amazing what you can see. Again, I remember one patient had not responded to anything I did for 2 years, and put her on B12. Next month, she's normal.
And what I like about B12 is, you're right, it's really non-toxic. You could probably inject a truckload of B12 in a patient, and you wouldn't have a side effect.
That's right.
Which is amazing.
That's right.
The thing about blood tests, though, and I want to discuss this with you, in Japan, reference ranges for B12 are actually different. They consider anything under 500 actually deficient. When I looked at research, if you have a serum level of B12 above 500, you pretty much can guess that they're getting enough in their brain. Now that's not 100%, but much more than our reference ranges, which basically, if it's greater than, I think, 140 or 150, you're considered not deficient. Now to me, you're right, the blood tests, at least in North America, are fairly useless, because if in fact you need a high concentration in your serum to get enough into your brain, then our reference ranges are missing a lot of patients who have a problem.
That's right, I agree with that.
Now, anything else that you could sort of expand upon about B12 before I ask you about some other nutrients, perhaps?
No, I think that pretty well. Well, we get the wrong kind of B12 anyway. we should get the hydroxycobalamin form, which is, and the only form available easily in Canada is cyanocobalamin, which in itself can have certain toxicity. We ought to have the hydroxycobalamin. In fact, and it was an article in JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, 15 years ago, claiming that we should only use hydroxycobalamin. We can't. I think that would be a lot more effective, and we should have a dose range which can be made up by compounding pharmacists. In one case, I've had to make up the hydroxycobalamin, 5 milligrams per mil, and I've injected that twice a week or 3 times a week.
Yeah, that's exactly what I do. I have a compounding pharmacist make me up 5 milligrams per mil, or 5,000 micrograms.
Yeah.
And I have my patients either learn to inject themselves, or I give them 1 or 2 injections a week until I see a response, or if no response after a certain trial, then I try obviously a different nutrient.
And by the way, Dr. Prowse, that's very good for chronic fatigue states.
Yeah.
It's based upon a study done in New Zealand by a very fine GP who was studying the connection between the size of the red blood cells and the size of the capillaries through which they have to travel. And most doctors think that every red cell is like every other, and that's totally untrue. They're all so different. And he found that with chronic fatigue states and many chronic diseases like multiple sclerosis, up to 40% of the red cells were so large that they couldn't traverse the capillaries. In other words, their tissues were being starved of oxygen. And he found that when you give these patients hydroxycobalamin, he uses 5 milligrams injection twice a week. He was able to cure a large number of his chronic fatigue states just by giving him a large quantity of hydroxycobalamin.
What's interesting about that is a lot of patients with anxiety also complain of fatigue. So maybe that's an indication. If they come, they have a lot of symptoms of anxiety like apprehension, fear, breathlessness, and maybe they also are very tired. Perhaps that would be an indication for B12.
Right. The one other thing, of course, reassurance is very important. You have to explain to your patient what anxiety is. They don't know what it is. They think they're having a heart attack. But if you can tell them, hey, you're not having a heart attack, your heart's beating fast. I often tell my patient, if you start having a heart attack, stop breathing. They look at you and surprised, what, stop breathing? I say, yeah, stop breathing. Let your oxygen, let your carbon dioxide build up so that, see, that'll relax you a bit. They have to be taught that if they start having a panic, it's not going to kill them.
Right.
You have to do that too.
Yeah, I think there is an element of counseling, obviously, with every patient to help them understand what they're going through.
Yeah.
Now, what about other vitamins or even amino acids, say? I mean, a lot of naturopathic doctors and even medical doctors will use like GABA or glycine or taurine for anxiety. Have you used any of these agents with any effectiveness?
No, the only agent I've used is tryptophan, which I've used for as an antidepressant and also to help people sleep. It's not that good. It helps half the people for sleeping, just about half. You have to give too much as an antidepressant, but I've become much more interested in 5-HTP, which available in 50 milligram tablets can be extremely helpful in some cases in helping people go to sleep. I just heard from a mother about her daughter, 16. You won't believe this. She says she never slept a day in her life. And she was on huge quantities of all the medication. Everyone was trying everything to get her to sleep. Poor mother on her own, not knowing what to do, heard about 5-HTP, and she put her on. One night she gave her 5 milligrams of HTP. She slept the whole night for the first time in her life. Amazing. One pill.
I think we should clarify that 5-HTP is the immediate precursor to serotonin.
Yes.
And serotonin is one of those neurotransmitters that makes people feel good, it relaxes them, improves a sense of well-being, so it would have anti-anxiety effects, presumably, as well as antidepressant effects.
I think so, and that's how I'm using it too. So I'm using a bit more of that than I used to, besides it's easier to get, and it's over the counter.
Now, it's interesting, because I use some other amino acids. Obviously, you may not use in your practice. I use glycine a lot for anxiety, and what I like about it is it tastes much like sugar.
Yeah.
So patients who don't mind the sweet taste, and most don't, what I have them do is basically place a little bit of glycine under their tongue, usually in about 500 milligram quantities, but often I work them up to about 10 grams. And it dissolves really quickly under the tongue, and therefore gets into the bloodstream.
Sounds great.
And I find that it does have the effect on actually producing calmness in patients who have panic. I don't think it's good for everyday use, but for acute panic, I found that it works in relatively, I would say, a few minutes. Sometimes within 10 minutes, it can abort a panic attack.
I'm going to have to try it.
Yeah, it's something that I advocate now, and I found really helpful.
Sounds good.
Now, how about the essential fatty acids? Have you ever actually seen that help with anxiety?
I haven't ever seen it used for the acute anxiety. Mm-hmm. I think in long-term treatment for anxiety or mood disorders, yes, I use it. I think it's more important for the treatment of, if the mood disorder is primarily depression, I think the essential fatty acids play a major role there.
And how high would you dose the EFAs? And what kind of EFA? Of course, we know there's omega-6, omega-3.
Yeah, I use the flaxseed, 1 to 2 grams 3 times a day, or if they want the liquid oil, not the capsules, 1 or 2 tablespoons or more per day. Or I'll use the fish oils. The salmon oil I use pretty often.
Do you find though fish oils are more effective than flaxseed oils?
Yes.
Yeah, I would say too, because when you look at data, the main compound of flaxseed oil is something called ALA, and the body cannot convert that really that well into EPA or DHA. So I think fish oils personally are a little bit more effective.
That's right, but I have to use the other for vegetarians and for people who don't like the taste of the salmon oil.
Now, do you put any value though when people talk about anxiety, almost like it's something in our genes? When you look at our ancestors, they had to really be mobilized and prepared for threats to their survival. A lot of people see anxiety as sort of a carryover from our ancestry, almost like we're overreacting to typical stresses of life. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah,
as well?
there is. I think there is. Of course, everything is genes. What isn't genes? Everything, the way we think, our eye color, our hair color, whether we're tall or short. The fact if you're going to be a 6'6" basketball player, that's in your genes. And I do think the fight or flight mechanism that you're talking about is extremely important. Mm-hmm. And many people under even the slightest stimulus will have an outburst of adrenaline, which is one of the main factors, and other hormones are discharged as well, corticosteroids, but the adrenaline discharge can be very, very surprising. Your heart pounds, you turn red, you sweat, you get sweaty, you feel faint. Some people do faint. And it certainly does that happen. Now, I haven't seen the evidence, but niacinamide, I think, is a major antidote to extra adrenaline. We know for sure that niacin does protect the body against the effect of extra adrenaline. This was a study done in Sweden at the Karolinska Institute, where they found that normally when you release adrenaline, it releases the essential fatty acids from the storage sites in the body. And if this happens too often, that starts building up your cholesterol levels. And they found that when they pre-treated the subject with niacin, the fatty acids were not released from the fat stores. In other words, it protected these people against the pathological effects of the adrenaline. Niacin does that.
It's amazing. You know what also is interesting is, in terms of protecting against adrenaline, just back to glycine for a second, it can inhibit sort of the release of adrenaline from a part of the brain called the locus coeruleus.
Okay.
And that's where all the norepinephrine fibers are actually begin in the body.
Right.
So I've also found that glycine can sort of help, I guess, somewhat protect against adrenaline as well.
Yeah.
Or at least noradrenaline.
Right. Probably adrenaline too,
Yeah.
because these are also made in the brain to a slight degree.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Hoffer, one of the things we haven't touched upon was the toxicity of niacin or niacinamide. But let's first talk about niacin. There's so much, I would say, there's too much concern on the toxicity, and you and I know that it's really a safe agent. Perhaps you can just expand upon that.
Yeah. I think that's a very important topic. It goes back many years. It goes back to 1945 when they were doing the LD50s, the toxicity tests of vitamins, and they found that you could kill a rabbit or a dog by giving him 5 grams of niacin per kilogram of body weight. So if you're a 70-pound man, you could take a half a pound of niacin. Well, I doubt anyone in the world is going to swallow that much niacin. And when they did the autopsy on these animals, they found that their livers were fatty. They created what they call fatty livers. Now, there's a possibility, there's a theoretical possibility, because niacin is what we call a methyl acceptor. It binds methyl groups, and if you cause a methyl deficiency, you can get a fatty liver. So everything seemed to make sense, that niacin, if you give too much, will cause these fatty livers. Okay. And then they began to test it. After we reported that niacin lowered cholesterol levels, by the way, that was one of my discoveries. It lowered cholesterol levels, and it also, we know today, it elevates the HDL. It's beautiful for that. And the first people to confirm our work were the Mayo Clinic. They did a fantastic job corroborating what we had done. And by this time, the word went out that niacin could be liver toxic. So the Mayo Clinic were concerned, and after they'd had their patients on niacin for 1 year, they did a complete investigation. They did something quite heroic. They did a live liver biopsy. They went in and took liver tissue, examined it very carefully under the electron microscope, and they couldn't find a thing wrong. These were nice, beautiful, healthy livers. So the clinical evidence wasn't there. But then doctors began to run these liver function tests, 3 or 4 of them. Now these are tests which measure the activity of the liver. And if you develop a toxic effect, if you take a toxic drug, or if you get jaundice, if there's something pathologically wrong with the liver function tests are elevated. So they made a natural assumption that any elevation of liver function test indicated that there was something toxic going on. Turns out that this is totally wrong, because all these tests do measure is the fact that your liver is more active. They then found out that when people take niacin, there was very often an increase in the liver function tests. And this got spread around, so now it's a basic belief in medicine. It's almost a mythology in medicine that you can't take niacin because of the elevation of liver function tests. What they don't tell you is that about 30–40% of all the drugs that man uses will do the same thing. And they also don't tell you that even though you might have elevated liver function tests, if you don't do a thing but do the test over again in a week or two, they're normal, even though you haven't stopped taking the niacin. I think the only really valid test of liver toxicity is jaundice, or so on, the hepatitis C or so on. And this is very rare. I used to see, I've given niacin to perhaps 5,000 to 10,000 patients since 1950. And in the first 10 years, we used to see, I think altogether 5 cases of jaundice. But in those days, the niacin wasn't very pure, and every time I opened up a bottle of niacin, I'd smell it. And often I could smell the nicotine. I shouldn't tell you that, but niacin is made from nicotine. And they hadn't purified it, so nicotine was present, but this doesn't happen anymore at all. I haven't seen a single case of jaundice in at least 20 years. And one of my patients who was schizophrenic, while he was on niacin, developed jaundice, so I took him off the niacin because that's what you do. You take him off everything. The jaundice went away, the schizophrenia came back. I put him back on niacin, the schizophrenia went away, and the jaundice did not come back. So it was not a case of liver function test at all. So in my opinion, it's safe, but in many doctors in the States, especially where they practice kind of legal medicine, they're always afraid they're going to be sued. They do recommend that people who take niacin should be given these liver function tests, and I think that's probably okay if the patient doesn't mind paying for them. And but I don't take them seriously unless the values are at least 3 times as high as they should be normally. And if that happens, then you stop the niacin to see if you can find out why it's happening. So I think niacin is safe. And the final question is, if niacin is that dangerous, where are the bodies? You'd expect to see bodies all over the street dead from niacin. No one's ever died from niacin.
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify, there's been, I believe, only 18 reports in over 50 years of use. And in most of those reports, the liver damage that was presumed to occur was reversible.
Yeah, but they called the liver damage based upon the liver function tests. Right. They didn't actually go in and look at the liver. Now, if I thought it would affect my liver, do you think I'd be taking it for the past 50 years?
Neither would I. I've been taking it for at least 7 or 8 years.
And I'm bragging. I'm not going to brag a bit. I have a lady in Saskatoon. She's 111 years old. She's the 2nd oldest Canadian. 2 years ago, she was doing cross-country skiing. Her mind is normal. She's been on niacin for 41 years. I put her on it in Saskatoon 41 years ago. I'm going for the world record. There's a woman in Russia, she's 116. And I'm betting that my patient will beat her.
Well, how about you?
Well, yeah, well, I'm 88. I'm nearly 88, and I don't think I'll hit 100. I really don't.
Now, you know, in terms of niacin toxicity, though, I would agree that if the liver enzymes are 3 times the upper limit of normal, then maybe you have to investigate. But I've now used it, I would say, in hundreds of patients, and I have yet to see 1 case of jaundice or a problem.
Yeah.
The only other form of vitamin B3 that we should talk about toxicity is niacinamide. I can recall only 1 case report in the literature of niacinamide causing, again, an elevation of liver enzymes, but there was jaundice, but everything did clear once it was stopped. Now, the dose of niacinamide in that report was 9 grams. I'm sure, like you, I've never given that anything close to 9 grams of niacinamide.
I never go higher than 6 grams of niacinamide, but there's another problem too. You do get nausea and vomiting. And some patients are not very bright. They don't stop taking their vitamins. If you develop severe nausea and vomiting and you keep taking the same niacin or niacinamide and keep on vomiting, you get dehydration. And I think many of these liver cases are probably acute dehydration from the excessive nausea and vomiting. So the rule is that as soon as you develop any discomfort, any abdominal discomfort, you stop the product, start again carefully. And children, they can't tell you. Children can't tell you I'm nauseated. They just stop eating. So if you have a child on niacinamide and goes off their food, you have to say, well, I wonder if it's the niacinamide. Then you have to take them off and start again at the smaller dose or go to another one of the preparations.
Now, you know, is there anything else about toxicity that we should know, or anything else?
Well, I tease my patients. I say to them, what do you think is the greatest danger of taking vitamins? Niacin. They're all embarrassed and frightened about that. What's the greatest danger of taking niacin? So then I wait for a while until they're really embarrassed. And then I say, the greatest danger is you'll live longer. And they suddenly relax, and they all say, yeah, I can deal with that.
Yeah,
and I believe that's true.
Yeah, it's incredibly safe.
Yeah.
Now, you know, we've talked a lot about niacin and its uses, and we've also touched a little bit upon schizophrenia, although most of our talk we've discussed anxiety. Is there any relationship between schizophrenia and anxiety?
There really is. Schizophrenia usually starts in adolescence, especially with boys. It starts around 11, 12, 15. The peak incidence is between 15 and 25. Girls, maybe a few years later. The early stages of schizophrenia are primarily anxiety. They can't learn as well, they can't concentrate well, they're pushed, they become a bit more anxious, they get a bit depressed. And if they go to the average GP, and even the psychiatrist, they'll always diagnose them as one of the other conditions, a mood disorder. Maybe they'll call them bipolar. If they tell you that they were high, occasionally they'll call them bipolar, or they may call them anxiety states. But one has to always look at these early cases because many of them are really schizophrenic. There are certain tests one could use, but I can't open that here. But so one has to be very much aware of that the early anxiety states during adolescence, and especially if they are characterized by a marked change in personality and in behavior. If a bright young boy who's top of his class in grade 10 doesn't do as well in grade 11, he now doesn't meet his friends, he's becomes seclusive in his room, you're dealing with more than anxiety, you're dealing with the initial evidence of schizophrenia. And if you put them either on niacin or niacinamide, the results are miraculous. Within a month or two, they'll be normal because you catch them so early.
Are there any other psychiatric conditions that coexist with anxiety besides maybe schizophrenia early on? How about, we know depression does, but anything else?
Yeah, I don't think there's a single disease that we ever treat where there's not some anxiety, even Alzheimer's. There's always some anxiety. But I want to tell you another story about schizophrenia because after all, this is Toronto. This is again Toronto story. I flew down here on Thursday and Wednesday night. I don't like flying anymore. I always get a bit apprehensive, which I never used to do, but it wasn't so bad this time. But I was feeling a bit down and I opened up my computer at 11 o'clock on Wednesday night and I get a long email message. And this man, I won't give you his name, he writes to me, he said, Dr. Hoffer, he said, I was at your lecture in 1973 when you spoke here in Convocation Hall. And I remember that lecture because the hall was plumb full. There were 1,500 people at the Convocation Hall. He said, I was schizophrenic. I was there with my mother. I had been told that I would never get well. There wasn't any treatment. There's not a thing that could be done for you. But he said, but I heard you talk. I said to myself, my God, maybe there is hope. Maybe there is a chance. So when I went back home, his mother phoned me, and so I referred her to the closest source. It was the Krabinsky Clinic in Winnipeg, Dr. Louis Krabinsky and his wife. So he flew out to Winnipeg. He was treated by Dr. Krabinsky. He became normal. He's been normal ever since. And now he became at that time a well-known author, a writer. He even published an album, and he dedicated it to me. I didn't even know that. So it's a beautiful letter which he describes how sick he had been and how well he has been ever since that time. So that kind of gave me a good feeling. All the work I've been doing for years is paying off because people are getting well.
Yeah, I can't think of any type of medicine, except for orthomolecular medicine, that truly encourages wellness. There's really little side effects. There's really nothing like it.
You're absolutely right. And I think it's a crying shame that it's being totally rejected by the Canadian Psychiatric Association profession. I think they're going to look back at this in the next 10 years and they're going to have to answer some very serious questions. Because think of the thousands of patients who have been deprived of their chance for recovery by their terrible adherence just to drugs.
Now, the modern medical establishment has now seen homocysteine as somewhat of a value, obviously, in looking at cardiovascular risk. I know that you've talked about homocysteine's relation to mental disorders. Is there any link to anxiety with homocysteine, perhaps?
Yeah, there is, because high homocysteine may be a biomarker for something wrong with the heart. You may have tachycardia, you may have extrasystoles, you may have an erratic heartbeat. And often these are the first symptoms of an anxiety attack. If you're feeling good and suddenly your heart starts pounding, you say, oh my God, I'm having a heart attack. Now, if you can cut down the frequency of these episodes, you're going to help these patients with anxiety. You explain it to them. And then what you do is you do whatever you have to repair the damage in the body using homocysteine as a marker. I don't know what role it plays, but using it as a marker. So you have to give them B12 and folic acid and pyridoxine, and I also think you have to give them niacin. And you put them on these major B vitamins, and within a month or two, their heart action will be normal. Even in the case of atrial fibrillation, which I've seen, they have become normal in 2 or 3 months, and they haven't had any more since.
Yeah, I mean, obviously part of the workup of anxiety is atrial fibrillation. And I've seen a lot of cases where they actually have anxiety with it, and just by giving them nutrients, it can somewhat improve it.
Yeah.
You know.
Actually, by talking about anxiety, we're in fact, Dr. Brosky, we're talking about all psychiatric patients. Every psychiatric patient, we go through exactly the same system. Allergies, diet, dependencies, deficiencies, minerals, even toxins. LSD, for example, will cause anxiety. So we're looking at all these things that might play a role in these psychiatric conditions. So that's why I think that when we diagnose, we have to pinpoint why the condition is there. Then we can use accurate treatment.
I don't think I could have said it better myself.
Thank you.
Throughout our talk today, Dr. Hoffer, you've mentioned a lot of case histories of your patients. Any other case histories that you can think about that have to do with anxiety and the orthomolecular approach?
I can think of a number. Of course, my specialty is schizophrenia, so I have many more schizophrenic case histories. But I think in the past 2 years, by the way, I do referral practice. I don't see any walk-ins. Every patient is referred to me by their GP. And I'd say that most of them have already been seen by psychiatrists, and by the time they come to see me, they're already taking medication. I had one old lady who brought along a printout of everything she was taking. You won't believe this, she was on 28 different drugs. 28 different drugs. It would take all the energy in her body just to get rid of all that junk. And so they all come to be heavily medicated, and they're dealing with lots of problems. But with the past 2 years, I've seen a lot of so-called bipolars and a large number of anxiety states as well. And I find that I've been using the same treatment. I don't have any particular anecdote about one of these anxiety states, except they get well so fast that I have a standing joke between my secretary and myself. A standing joke is, hey, I'm getting these patients well too quickly. I'm going to lose income. You can't do that. How are you going to build a practice if you get your patients well so fast? And these are patients who come along and they've had anxiety for maybe half their life. The last half of their life, they've been terribly anxious, tired, depressed. And in many of these cases, there's without question there's a history that they love milk. Or they hate milk. Doesn't matter, either one. They love milk or they hate milk. But if they hate milk, they love cheese. Dead giveaway. If you find anyone who hates milk and loves cheese, it's a milk allergy. And so these had various types of allergies, and I put them on my program, which I always modify by adding the vitamins as well, because as I mentioned earlier, they've had trouble absorbing these nutrients. And by the way, under chronic stress, for example, in the Hong Kong Veterans Association, they were stressed in 44 years in Japanese prisoner of war camps. They come home very, very sick, and they have all multiple dependencies, I think, due to their tremendous malnutrition. So this is a factor. So I put these women on the program, and I remember one particular, she came back and she said to me, Dr. Hoffer, she said, it's so great to have my brain back again. Great feeling to have my brain back again. With schizophrenics, the same thing. And I have a few patients where you have to be extremely patient. I have patients who didn't get well for 20 years, and then after 20 years, they started getting well. And I saw a young man in 1972. He was one of the sickest psychotic patients I've ever seen. He had everything. Visual hallucinations, auditory hallucinations. He was disorganized, he was paranoid, he was depressed, suicidal, always hearing voices. And I've been seeing him now every 3 months for the past 22, 23 years. And I saw him last week, and he came in and he said, Dr. Hoffer, as we walked into the office, he said to me, I have just been remembering how sick I was when I first saw you. He said, I was thinking, isn't it fantastic to feel as good as I do now? And now he'll never work again because he's lost most of his life in being sick. But he's become physically fit. He's taking Kung Fu from a Kung Fu master. He's halfway there. He's very physically fit. And it's amazing to see this fantastic change in this young man who was so terribly sick.
Now contrast, that's such a success story with orthomolecular medicine. How would that compare to the mainstream or conventional approach? I mean, they're dramatically different.
Well,
people get well with orthomolecular medicine. Do people live a functional quality of life on these other drugs?
No. If you are going to be treated by olanzapine, some of these drugs, that's the only treatment. Take it from me. You're never going to get well because the drugs in themselves cause a toxic psychosis. It's what I call a tranquilizer psychosis. I'm glad you opened that, Dr. Prowski. That gives me a chance to talk. In 1850, the term schizophrenia didn't exist. They were called insane. The doctor would say, "My dear man, you are insane." You know, that's pretty definite. You are insane. The Quakers developed a treatment called the moral treatment of the insane. And that meant that they set up their own houses. They housed 12 patients in these houses. They provided them with shelter, good food, and they treated them with kindness and respect. Half of them got well. Half of them got well in 1850. No drugs, no vitamins, just with these three basic attributes of good treatment: shelter, food, and kindness. Today, between 1900 and 1950, worldwide, if you went into a mental hospital, it was a life sentence. You never got out. The recovery rate was 0. Between 1950 and the year 2000, with the use of the most modern drugs, and by the way, they're very effective. They're really good for the bottom line of the drug companies. In fact, I read a recent study published in one of the Canadian journals written by Canadian psychiatrists comparing the new antipsychotic drugs against the old ones. And they found there were absolutely no difference, with one major difference: the new ones cost 10 times as much. So you can see the major profit from the new drug goes to the drug companies, not to the patient or to the community. So I challenge anyone. If I'm going to fly on an Air Canada flight and you tell me that the pilot is taking Zyprexa, I'll say, "Hey, I want off that flight." And the air companies know that too. They will not allow anyone to fly if they're taking any medication. Drugs do help, they do suppress symptoms, but they do not allow you to get well. And they have major, major side effects. They create the metabolic syndrome, obesity, increased diabetes, high blood cholesterol, high triglycerides, brain damage. Drugs. And we are creating a huge problem over the next 10, 20 years. We're going to have a huge block of patients in our community who are being drugged for years without any chance for recovery. You will not ever get well if you depend only on medication.
And I would say that's obviously not just true for schizophrenia. I think that's any mental condition.
Yeah.
Like anxiety, depression, anything.
Now, when I write, I don't go out that strong. I do maintain, however, that fewer than 10% of all modern patients on medication ever get well. I should tell you what my definition of recovery is, by the way. You're free of signs and symptoms. You're getting along well with your family. You're getting along well with the community. And you're paying income tax. That's my definition. People on tranquilizers never pay income tax.
You know, a lot of people say, well, if orthomolecular medicine is so good, why doesn't everybody know about it?
Well, I've been confronted with that question for at least 40 years. It's my favorite question, by the way. And so this happened to me in New York City. I was invited by the nutrition section of the New York Medical Society to talk to them for 18 minutes. I don't know why 18 minutes, why not 17 or 19, but I was given 18 minutes. So I accepted. I thought that's great. There were a nice group of doctors, about 12 sitting around a long table. And I started my presentation. Now, I used to be a professor of psychiatry, and I often still think like a professor. You know, professors have a built-in 50-minute section in their brain. They start to lecture at 9, and they know that they better get out of there within 15 minutes or the students will all leave and they'll stampede out of there. So we have that built-in mechanism. We know what to do. And so I started my talk. And on my left was a young professor of medicine, I thought. He looked like a professor. We can recognize each other. And so he did the right thing. He didn't want to hear what I was saying, so he did the absolutely correct thing. He fell asleep. And exactly that's what you do if you're listening to a dull lecture. Fall asleep. What else can you do? So I thought, hey, that's bright. He knows exactly how to deal with this problem. He's sleeping. And I finished my presentation, and just at 17 minutes, he awakened. You know, I had that nice mechanism there. And he wakened up and shook himself and wide awake. And then he said, "Dr. Hoffer, I have a question for you." I said, "Great, what's your question?" He said, "If the orthomolecular treatment is so goddamn good, how come everyone isn't using it?" So I said, "Would you really like to know?" And he said, "Yeah." So I said, "Do you read the Bible?" Well, that kind of threw him. And he didn't answer. I said, "Well, if you had read the Bible, do you remember the story about Moses who took 40 years to cross from Egypt into Israel? Why did it take him 40 years to walk around the desert in circles when you can walk across, if you're a good walker, in 2 weeks?" And so I said, the Bible tells you why, because Moses realized that if he's going to attack the promised land and invade it with the young men and women, He wouldn't be able to do so if he had to work only with slaves. The Israelites had been slaves in Egypt for 200 years. They had been raised with a slave mentality. How could they possibly be these keen fighters they would need? So he said, let's walk them around until 2 generations die. 2 generations die, and their sons and daughters will have been bred in freedom, and they'll be the ones who will be our soldiers and who will take over the promised land. And the Bible tells you that. They're not shy. So I told him that story, and then I added, and if and when 2 generations of doctors who have been raised in slavery to the present views are dead, orthomolecular treatment will be well established. He didn't say another word. That finished him off entirely. That's the answer. Because we are essentially a conservative profession. It takes a long time for new ideas to get established. It takes on the average 40 to 50 years for any good new idea in medicine to be established, even a stethoscope. Why did it take 40, 50 years before doctors accepted a stethoscope? It's our history.
You've talked a lot about the lack of acceptance of orthomolecular medicine among medical doctors in the medical establishment. What I find interesting is in naturopathic medicine, we basically utilize all these orthomolecular approaches and put them into clinical practice. I think a lot of it has to do with the education. In naturopathic medical school, we probably get, I would say, well over a few hundred hours of clinical nutrition, as well as other natural therapeutics. Whereas in medical school, I think it's maybe, 1 hour, or it's so insufficient.
Yeah, it's insufficient. I've seen, over the past 6 years, I've had 40 medical students in their 3rd and 4th year medicine come and spend 2 days with me as part of their postgraduate training at UBC in Victoria. I always ask them, how many hours of nutrition did you get? And they always say, 1. And one woman surprised me. She said, we nearly got 1. I said, what do you mean nearly got 1? She said, he didn't show up. If you don't get any nutritional teaching, obviously you have to conclude it doesn't mean anything. It's totally unimportant. I think that I don't blame the medical profession really. I'm pretty harsh on them. I blame our medical schools. They are teaching pretty good medicine in surgery and obstetrics and gynecology. But when it comes to nutrition, they're just not there. They're just not there. And the fact that your students are getting 200 or 300 hours, I think that's excellent news. It's really good news. I think nutrition ought to be at least 20% of the curriculum of every medical school.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's a shame because, naturopathic medicine is a small but obviously growing profession.
Yeah.
And if medical doctors were sharing our views and they were more in line with what we did, I think just the ramifications in terms of health would be incredible.
I think so.
And hopefully, this session will at least open up that door. That's my hope for today.
I hope it does too.
I'd just like to say thank you so much for joining us today and talking about mental illness, anxiety disorders, and bringing basically all of your experience to the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Browski. Actually, you're a good interviewer.
Thank you for being part of this Grand Rounds on anxiety disorders. As you've heard, Dr. Hoffer and myself have talked about many treatments that can be utilized for the treatment of anxiety disorders, such as niacin or niacinamide, vitamin B12, inositol, and even amino acids like lysine and tryptophan. What I hope that you hear is that the orthomolecular approach is really the safest approach. It's unmatched, I think, by any current or contemporary method of treatment for anxiety disorders. And it is the approach that we want you to use when assessing and evaluating your patients with anxiety disorders. Thank you.